Oh, get started? Okay.
Oh,
so hi, thanks for coming to our session. I'm Matt Trinesh.
and I'm Matthew Oliver, I guess we're the Matts.
Yeah. We're going to be talking today about Keystone Federated Swift and how you can get the most out of your object store in a federated environment. So just before we dive into that specific case, I think it's important to talk a bit about Keystone Federation. And Keystone Federation basically lets you decouple your identity provider from your service provider. It lets you basically control your identity independently. What this is normally used for is sharing your resources between multiple deployments. So you have multiple OpenStack deployments and you can share identity either through an external identity provider or between two Keystone instances and share the resources between them while only having one source of identity. And that's basically just Keystone Federation. But you can also use it with Swift, which has its own auth layer. But when you use it Swift with Keystone, there are some additional considerations.
Yes. So Swift is an end-to-end object storage solution. It supports different types of authentication middleware, and Keystone's just one of them. Another advantage of Swift's design is it can have more than one authentication middleware. When you have more than one in your proxy pipeline, you use a thing called reseller prefixes to differentiate between which auth middleware is responsible for authenticating what user. So when you're setting up with Keystone, you actually need two middlewares: the auth token from the Keystone middleware package, I think it's called, or it is, and Keystone auth inside Swift.
Now, go ahead.
I'll keep going. So I'm going to talk about a few topologies. The first one I've dubbed false federation because it's not actually using Keystone Federation at all. If we're looking from a Swift point of view, where we're a Swift cluster, but we may want users to authenticate to different keystones around the world, wherever, in whatever environment you want. Like I kind of alluded to already, Swift already does this. Swift has the ability to have multiple authentication middlewares. So this first version is allowing you to have multiple, you can turn that one, Keystone, here you go, auth token middlewares and Keystone pairs in your pipeline. So in this brief example, you can see that if someone wants to talk to the blue Keystone, all their accounts are prefixed with key, as you can see down the bottom there. And if you want to talk to the green Keystone, you will prefix all your users with auth. That's what it's saying. The advantage of this is really simple to set up because it already kind of exists as an ability inside Swift. Disadvantages is each of these auth tokens in Keystone has not been designed to have more than one auth token middleware in a pipeline. So each of these are going to go and try and talk to each Keystone, which is not so nice. This is kind of high on every request coming in then to Swift. You're going to have a lot more latency as it goes and tries to authenticate, and only one of them is going to work, but it's okay. The other current problem is Keystone auth in Swift doesn't allow you to do this. But I've got a patch, and you can see at the end, if you do want to play with it, that fixes this. I plan on polishing it up and actually pushing it upstream, but we've had lots of work to do, as Coda can attest, to try and get stuff into Swift lately, so I haven't had a chance to polish it up.
The next topology we looked at was using two discrete Swift clusters and then Keystone to Keystone Federation. So we used one Keystone as an identity provider for the other and vice versa. This is pretty straightforward and was actually the use case I had in mind when we started this project because Matt lives in Australia and I live in New York, and having our own Swift infrastructure and Keystone infrastructure locally and sharing data between them. It's pretty straightforward, and it provides a lot of advantages on top of the fake federation that Matt was just talking about. The biggest one is resource isolation. So we have our own isolated resources and they only work with each other except for when they need to authenticate with each other's source of identity. It gives us the most flexibility in what we can do because you can control each one independently and control how they talk to each other. And compared to the false federation, the auth latency and the problems Matt was just describing doesn't exist because it's only ever talking to its local keystone except for when it needs the SAML assertion from the other identity provider. The disadvantages with this, though, are that it's incredibly complex to set up compared to the false federation. Besides having to set up your own federation pipeline with the SAML assertion, your external identity provider, and Keystone to get everything working together, you also have to manage the mapping. And this is where things start getting really complicated, is because you have to set up the mapping from your external identity provider to Keystone. There's a Keystone configuration file to configure this mapping, so the external identity provider maps to something in Keystone. And then when Swift talks to Keystone, it has its own ideas for how auth works, and it has to map the Keystone information that it's getting to something internal to Swift. And when you're trying to do things from someone else's Keystone in your Keystone and then in your Swift, you have to make sure you manage the roles correctly in that mapping, as well as all of the names so they map correctly so that when you switch between things, they work fine. And then the other thing is when you set up container sync, which is where you can basically share containers between the deployments after you manually set up the trust between them and then specifically list which containers you want to transfer and keep in sync. There's latency between those because you have to wait for the data to transfer from one side of the world to the other or between your two different deployments. But given these trade-offs, we thought about looking at a third deployment model, which was the global Swift cluster.
Yeah, so that wasn't good enough for me. What I would like, the golden standard for me would be, you'd have Swift can scale globally, right? So why aren't we using one big Swift cluster? And wherever I go, say I live in blue Keystone environment, why can't I go visit Matt in the green one and still access my data? Because everywhere I go, I want to get the same stuff. Turns out, you can change the font. It turns out, I've obviously talked about the main advantages there, right? If I travel, I have access to all my data straight away. I put something over here, it's available on the other side. Like Matt was talking about, I only really ever talking to one Keystone, so the latency issues are gone. But it turns out it sounds really simple, but it isn't. In fact, right now it's not quite possible to do it with Keystone. Keystone doesn't allow you to do that stuff. When you start setting up connecting Swift to Keystone in the storage, what is the endpoint? When you're setting up the storage endpoint for Swift, that URL actually has to map to a storage URL, which maps to an account name. And that's your account name. You're going to be writing stuff into Swift. Now, currently, the only thing that you can put into that endpoint in Keystone is, say, something like the project ID or the tenant ID. Now, when we take a step back and we talk about federation, when we're doing this mapping sync, we can sync the names of groups. We can do the names of projects, but never this tenant ID. And what happens on the service provider is it will make a shadow account or shadow group or shadow whatever, but it means it's going to have its own unique ID. So it gets really complex. So it doesn't quite work. But in theory, all you need to do is make sure wherever you go, you can get the same account name. I do have a hacked version that actually works. I'm not going to go into the details because I don't think we have much time left already. But because this was supposed to be a full talk, and it's now a lightning talk for 10 minutes, we've been working on a series of blog posts, you can go to the next one, that will actually explain where all the code is that I've been playing with, how it all works. If you want to know how I approached it, I've got the working with the golden standard. It's a bit brittle at the moment, and I think there are probably better ways to do it, but I want to get something up for you guys. Yeah. So.
And the other big blog post that's worth pointing, the other key links on here are Colleen Murphy did an excellent blog post on how to set up Keystone Federation, both with an external identity provider and as well as Keystone to Keystone. For us, following that was much more useful, both in understanding how Keystone Federation worked, as well as setting it up than the official documentation. And the thing we were talking about with the complexity of the mapping, Keystone has some official documentation that is very thorough, but confusing if you don't have prior knowledge on how to set up those mappings. And something else that's worth pointing out that we haven't talked about yet is there's a fourth topology which we didn't investigate but is commonly used already, which is you use an external identity provider with Keystone Federation, and then you write a custom Swift auth plugin, which is not that difficult, to leverage that same identity provider directly. And you can leverage that to avoid going to Keystone at all if you're using an external identity provider. And that's something that we know that people out there are already doing. So with that, that was all of our prepared material. If there are any questions, I don't know how much time we have left. We have a minute, so probably not time for questions. So thank you.